And I will be the first one on a podcast in front of the world to say, I want to make a lot of money and I want to be incredibly successful and I want to be known, but I don't want it to be the core part of my identity, right? I want to first be a Jew and a father and a husband and someone who moved to Israel. And the big challenge is, how does that not get taken over? It's funny because now entrepreneurship is like, it's seen as such a cool thing. I steer people away from starting their own companies, depending on the individual and their circumstance. I was in college and I looked around me and I basically said, if I continue down this path, what is going to be the most likely outcome in my life? And the most likely outcome, I think, is that I'm going to be incredibly quote unquote successful monetarily and financially. I'll probably be very rich in my 40s and 50s, but there is a high likelihood that I'll be divorced and my kids won't talk to me.
Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to Shark Tank. Shark Tank is a podcast about the challenges and opportunities of being a Ben Torah in the workforce. This week, we're joined by my friend Alec Kremins. Alec, welcome to Shark Tank, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Yaakov. Excited to be here.
So before we jump in, a quick reminder to please leave a 5-star review and hit subscribe. It really helps us bring this content to bigger and broader audiences. So thank you so much for that. So Alec, around a year ago, I think you had a very big transition in your life. So you could tell us what you're up to leading up to that fateful day and what was next.
It's actually, it is Shkacha Pratis that we are recording this podcast. I don't know when it's going to go out to the listeners, but we're recording this on August 4th, 2026. And exactly 1 year ago, on August 4th, 2025, I was let go from my stable job. I was, I say this very humbly, but I was living the dream of a lot of Americans that make Aliyah to Israel, where I was working an amazing job at an American tech company, making an American salary and living here in Israel and basically just balancing it and really enjoying. And out of the blue, I was let go from that job and basically had a decision to make. I just found out my wife was pregnant with our first child at that point as well. And it was a tough day, but I'm sure we'll talk about this more in the episode, but decided to, instead of looking for a job, start my own company, go all in. And a year later, it's been the most rewarding, but also the most difficult year of my life in terms of, career.
So before we sort of jump in a little deeper, maybe just a little more background about yourself, where you're from, and like what were you doing? What are your skills? What is your passion within the space that you were working?
I grew up in New Rochelle, sure familiar to a lot of your listeners. I actually went to public school throughout middle school and high school and was always very passionate about entrepreneurship. Grew up with reading kind of magazines with Mark Zuckerberg and kind of all these big entrepreneurs, a lot of which, are Jewish. So that was always a big part of my childhood. And, after high school, decided to, I got into a pretty awesome business program at the University of Michigan, direct into the business school, and kind of continued that hard work ethic there. In kind of my college experience is actually when I was Choser Teshuva and met a few of the Rabbanim there and spent a little time in Israel. But I was still always on this, high-strung, ambitious career path where most people either go into investment banking or into management consulting. I knew I always wanted to do something a little bit different. When I graduated college, actually in college, I started a company called Ember. We made caffeine gummies. I started that with my cousin and it was very exciting. And we were selling on Shopify, Amazon. I learned a lot, maybe a conversation for a different time. Ended up folding that down. And then it was kind of just being in the right place at the right time. I joined a startup, which at that point was about 200 people. It was a company called Ramp. Just recently, I think their latest valuation round valued them at around $40 billion as like the fastest growing company, I think, in the history of the world. And you could fact check me on that. And was, joined relatively early. I learned a ton. And people joke that I have the most expensive Aliyah in the world because I moved to Israel before my equity vested because I really wanted to come to Israel and came over here. Then I got a job at Beehive, kind of leading partnerships at Beehive, which is an email newsletter platform. That was an amazing experience. And basically kind of my background in marketing is really, it started off in sales, partnerships, and then really building brands. Like, I've been posting a lot on LinkedIn, built a little bit of an audience there. And, I could go more in detail on any of that, but that's kind of high level.
Yeah, so I would love to pick up on one of the things that you said, which was you spoke about your tendency to do things a little bit differently, go against the grain, be unique, which I think is very important in the context of this podcast. People who are living Torah values in the workforce, they're usually, day to day, not amongst a strong community of like-minded individuals. From that angle, that perspective, this podcast is a bit of a bridge in making an online community to bridge that gap. But on a very, practical day-to-day basis, they feel very alone. And I think there is a lot of value in the ability to say, these are my values and might be different than other people's values, and that's okay. So we can go a little bit deeper on that part of your journey, specifically as it pertains to your decision to be chozer b'tshuva, your decision to not take the classic track of investment banking or management consulting, and sort of how early in your life did you realize that was like a feature of you?
Yeah, great question. And it's funny because now entrepreneurship is like it's seen as such a cool thing, and like it's a lot of people are kind of promoting that, where a lot of times, and this might be part of our conversation, I steer people away from starting their own companies, depending on the individual and their circumstance. But to address your question more directly, all of the best decisions I've ever made in my life, I went with the hard decision, whether it was moving to Israel, whether it was my career path, usually where there was a fork in the road and one was the more comfortable decision and one was the more difficult decision. 10 times out of 10, taking the more difficult decision ended up paying off for me. And, I'm thinking about whether it was kind of the underlying, similarity between whether it's being chozer b'tshuva and becoming religious or, starting my own company. And I think the underlying secret behind both is I don't think the purpose of life is to live a comfortable life. I think for a lot of people, maybe you strive for comfort. And to me, that always seemed like something was missing. You just talk about Israel. Like I moved to Israel and I think it was one of the greatest decisions in my life. And there have been so many times where I had to rush in the middle of the night to a bomb shelter. But my life here is so much more meaningful than it would be living on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And it's a lot less comfortable here, probably. So I think life is about finding meaning and not about finding comfort. And whether it is searching for a job or deciding to start my own company or staying where I am, kind of traditional versus becoming religious, I'm optimizing my life for meaning and not for comfort. And I think a lot of people in our day and age think that by chasing comfort, that they'll find meaning in that. And I think that's a big mistake.
That's fascinating. And I think there's a story I once read about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who he once advised, I think it was a senator of some sort, on a less comfortable path. And the person who was advising sort of pointed out and complained that that's going to be a very difficult and challenging route. And I believe the Rebbe said, "Can you show me the contract that you have signed that your life was going to be easy? Like, did someone
Yeah.
promise that to you, and include that in the terms of conditions of your life here?" Which that was very powerful. And maybe just to pick up on that very, very important point, when you talk about optimizing for meaning and our work, so people oftentimes, comes up a lot in this podcast, or listeners reach out to me, they're looking for meaning and they don't feel that their work is providing them meaning. So I think already one thing which you pointed out and I'm happy to hear more about is the fact that maybe realizing the distinction between optimizing for comfort and optimizing for meaning. And in general, meaning at work is its whole other sugya that we talked about a little bit before. And I'm wondering if you can share sort of how you've experienced that journey in your own life.
Yeah. And really, just to be vulnerable for a second, I'm still trying to figure all of this out. So I don't want to pretend for a second that I have all of the answers. The first thing that I will say, which is very important, and I think as a Jew, it's kind of a reframe here, which is that I think even if you're not incredibly passionate about what you do for work, the fact, especially if you are an Orthodox Jew, and that money that you're earning every single month is providing for you and for your family, for Shabbos meals, to send your kids to a Jewish education, I think you can find a tremendous amount of meaning in that. And this might be unpopular advice, and this might be advice that a lot of listeners don't want to listen to, but again, I really dissuade people from starting companies unless they really feel a deep urge or desire or like they need to start something on their own. Because I'll be the first to say and to admit it is incredibly difficult, incredibly strenuous, both from, a relationships perspective on navigating things and also just internally, it's a really big struggle. So in terms of, I guess to answer your question, I don't think I think you can derive meaning from any job that you do. And like that, right? There's the famous story I think of. I don't know if it was of Aryeh Levine, the tzaddik of Yerushalayim, who saw like a street cleaner. Maybe it's attributed to other people, but a street cleaner cleaning the streets of Yerushalayim and how he was like, the street cleaner was very excited. And I don't know the exact story, but I think Rav Aryeh Levine was like, wow, like, how are you so excited? And he was like, it's such a zchut to be able to clean Yerushalayim, to keep the streets of Yerushalayim clean. And I think anyone, no matter what they do, even if they're in Excel every day, if they reframe it, it can be pretty powerful. That might not be what everyone wants to hear. And I have other eights around that, but I think that's the first thing to kind of be straight on the record.
Right. And I guess happy to hear more, but also specifically, there's meaning, but there are different, I guess, levels and shades and gradients of meaning. So, and then I think there's, I guess, another way of thinking about it is the question of like identity, who I am. Do you view your work as a core part of your identity? And that is connected, maybe separate to the sense of meaning. Cause, going back to your first example. So obviously, work for paycheck for a life that is along Torah values is one thing, but that framework completely removes the work from the identity. The work is really just there to fund the identity, which could come from other places. Whereas if there's more meaning to the work, more passion, more connection, then it's closer to our identity. So wondering if how you think about those things interconnected with each other.
It's something I'm honestly still figuring out, and I'll tell you why. Initially, in the world that I grew up in, your work is your identity. In fact, the first question, even a lot of people probably in frum circles ask each other is, nice to meet you, what do you do? And by what do you do, they don't mean what your hobbies are. They mean, what do you do basically for a paycheck to pay the bills? Are you a lawyer? Are you a doctor, etc.? That is in the secular world. And, when I started becoming religious, the thing that I heard sometimes, and I've heard this many times, is like, we took the purpose of life, or I guess we took the curse, right? If you think about Adam Arishon and what the curse was, to work the field, and we made that the purpose of life. I also reject that idea a little bit, because I think, at least for me, I feel this is so deeply ingrained, this desire to not only, make money and have a profitable business, but to serve people, to create, to build things. I do think it's a core part of my identity. But ultimately, it's about realizing that it's a dance between Histadlus and Bitachon. And that's really what entrepreneurship is. When you're working for a paycheck, it's much easier to have that dance, in my opinion. When you're working for yourself, that dance gets a lot more complicated and convoluted. So at least right now, where I'm holding, is it right or is it not right? I don't know. I definitely feel like work is a big part of my identity. And that's a lot of what gets me excited and gets me motivated. Is that the right outlook from a Torah perspective? I don't know. Like, I would turn to you, Yaakov. You probably know a lot more, and can quote the sources a lot more than me. But it's something that I openly struggle with.
Right. So, I mean, I'm the host of this podcast, so I ask the questions here, as they say. But it's an interesting topic, and I think also specifically we could talk sources, but I'm more interested in hearing what people's real life lived experiences are. And I know that you started your career in America. You mentioned sort of your college friends who went to a very specific, very high paying, but also specific type of lifestyle in their careers. Then you made Aliyah. You meet people here, whether in the business world or other circles. So I'm wondering how you see both in terms of the different industries and different societies, different cultures, and how that influences people's approaches to their identity and work being integrated or separate from each other.
Yeah, I'll tell you maybe a story, which hopefully that can answer your question. And hopefully this guy is not listening, because he would. I'm going to keep it anonymous, but he would really hate me for saying this. One of my close friends here in Israel, I met him, I think a mutual friend introduced me to him, and we met at a shir. And then after I saw him at Shachris, and I was like, wow, this guy he's serious. Like, he was learning chitas in the morning. He was, I know he had like, I think 8 or 9 kids, but like a really serious guy. And we had a deep conversation, and I was like, wow, I got to, I want to become friends with this guy. I see so much in common with him. And I remember he invited me to his house for Shabbos. And I went to his house, and I get to his house, and I'm like, what the heck does this guy do for a living? Because his house was like a ginormous mansion. And then, I didn't ask him right away. It didn't come up right away, because it was still kind of that deeper connection besides work. Like, we were speaking about different, concepts about the Parsha and Chassidus and different things. And then later on, maybe like 3 months later, I mentioned his name to someone, and he was like, he has one of the biggest hedge funds in all of Israel and does like a crazy amount of tzedakah. And the only reason I tell that story is, at least from his perspective and from my perspective meeting him, that was not at all his core identity. And that wasn't the core point where I met him in the relationship. Where I met him in the relationship was Jew, father, someone who picked up and moved to Israel, someone who's kind, loving. And it happens to be that, thank God, he gives a lot of tzedakah. And it's like, what's the ikr and what's the tofel? And to me, I felt like that was the healthiest thing. And I will be the first one on a podcast in front of the world to say, I want to make a lot of money and I want to be incredibly successful and I want to be known, but I don't want it to be the core part of my identity, right? I want to first be a Jew and a father and a husband and someone who moved to Israel. And the big challenge is, how does that not get taken over? And one of the differences, the last thing I'll point out and why I love living here in Israel is, and specifically I'll talk about maybe Yerushalayim for a second, is I have a lot of friends like this where I first met them in a context of like shul or a kumzitz or whatever it was. And then later I realized, oh, wow, like maybe there could be a business partnership or like this guy works in a similar type of industry versus whether it was in college or even New York. The first point of meeting is, what do you do? What do you do? Oh, maybe like we can help each other out financially. And then like we figure out our other interests and our other hobbies.
That's really interesting. And I think, as much as you said that you're still figuring things out, I think you can learn a lot about a person from their role models and who they look up to. So even the fact that you've been attracted to role models along these lines says a lot and is very impressive. And it's really important. I think this podcast to just restate that and come back to that all the time, deciding what role models are and that distinction between sort of what really matters to you and where you're working and where you're making your money, which can all be meaningful, but in different levels. So thank you for sharing that. Just one thing that I'd asked you before, and I'm wondering if you have anything else to share about this, but your sort of friends in America who took a very specific path to management consulting, investment banking, and stuff like that. It's something we've come up on the podcast at different points and talked about whether that's like a feasible Ben Torah route or not. And I'm sure these friends were from Michigan or not necessarily guys from yeshiva and whatever, but like, have you been in touch with them at all? What do you see from their lives that influences how you look at things today?
Yeah, sure. First off, I think it is for sure feasible for a Ben Torah. Is it the most optimal if you want to be learning 3 Siddharim a day and working in investment banking? I don't know if that's possible, but at least for what I consider a Ben Torah, and one of the biggest parts of a Ben Torah, I think, is being a Kiddush Hashem and lighting up the workplace. I think it is incredibly feasible. And I think you could even make more of a Kiddush Hashem being in an environment where there are a lot fewer of those types of people. And I personally have friends that work incredibly demanding jobs in the top firms and funds in the world, and they are very committed to an Orthodox lifestyle. It happens to be that most of my friends that are in those roles, because, I grew up non-religious and everything, they're not what you'd consider a Ben Torah, although most of them happen to be Jews. And I think, again, it is, it's hard for me to sort of generalize. I think the biggest, what I really dislike, or what I have a reaction against, is a lot of people do things just to do them, just because everyone else is doing them. And I think that there's this, like, people are drawn towards this and people automatically do this, and people think, I need to go to this university, I need to follow in this footsteps, I need to do this. And I think, and I even heard someone say this to me, it's like, it's such a good trade. Like, you trade 2 years of your life, 3 years of your life to work an incredibly demanding job, and then the world becomes your oyster. Like, once you do 2 years in McKinsey or in Goldman, you could do anything. And I'm like, why would you trade 2 to 3 years of your life? Like, that is the most precious asset, the most precious thing you have. The one caveat I will say is, like, if someone goes in debt and takes student loans and pays a ridiculous amount for college and doesn't have any support around them, I understand, like, the allure towards that, and like, you need to make money and pay back those loans, and no judgment there whatsoever. But I think that doing someone just because everyone else is doing it, and that's the thing that happens, to me, like, I have automatically an averse reaction towards that.
I'm sure there are people who are in these very intense roles. You said there is definitely a potential to be a Kiddush Hashem, which I appreciate. And I also are familiar with people who are that. But there's also a dark underbelly to this world of, high powered, high income roles at these very prestigious firms. And I think we were talking before, and you mentioned that you've been exposed to that also. So I think it's worth it to be aware of the full picture. And if you could share a little bit about what that looks like, because some people are very successful and some people have it really rough.
Yeah, it is a great question. And it honestly is very related to, that moment I decided to explore Judaism a lot deeper. I was in college and I looked around me and I basically said, if I continue down this path, what is going to be the most likely outcome in my life? And the most likely outcome, I think, is that I'm going to be incredibly quote unquote successful, monetarily and financially. I'll probably be very rich in my 40s and 50s, but there is a high likelihood that I'll be divorced and my kids won't talk to me. And maybe I'll have a house in the Hamptons. And maybe by secular standards in society, I'll be successful. But to me, that sounds like being miserable and not like being successful. And unfortunately, thank God, most of my friends, I'm 27, so most of my friends from college are that age, and I really hope that they have incredible meaning in their lives. And I know a lot of them, and I really don't think they're going to turn out that way. But I think overall, in terms of society, if you just go down that path in that rat race, that unfortunately seems like a pretty likely outcome, even if we just look at pure statistics.
Fascinating. And it's so interesting to hear how sort of your work considerations, your career path, and your Judaism are like intertwined, which is very interesting. So going back to that moment a year ago today that you were let go, I'm wondering, you mentioned you decided to start your own company, and I'm wondering if you talk a little bit more about that from a spiritual perspective. I think a lot of people love the stability, and I'm sure it's individual, the stability of a paycheck from a company that is paying them the same amount every month. So you went down a very different route. So I'm wondering from a sort of hashkafic Torah lens, why that was something that was important for you.
This is an important question and a deep question. I think first off, I said this once and I'll keep saying it again. This is definitely not the right path for everybody. In fact, I don't think it's the right path for most people. Why I decided to go down this path, I don't think it started off, if I'm being honest, with a certain hashkafic or Torah lens. I think it was from a very personal lens of just like me having this deep desire always, even when I was working at other companies, to really want to work for myself, to have that independence, to have that level of kind of creativity, free flowing ideas. And I think it started from there. But very soon I saw how it was deeply tied to a lot of what I was learning about in Judaism. And we could go down a bunch of tangents here, but I'll kind of just give some big ideas that I've been thinking about recently. There's this idea that the ultimate goal is to really emulate Hashem. Like just like Hashem has different midot, we should emulate Hashem's midot. And that's why women are on such a high level, because women give birth. They actually and that's the closest thing to what Hashem does when he creates people. And I think lahavdil, because my wife would kill me if she heard me saying that starting a company is similar to childbirth, because I'm sure one is a lot more painful. However, starting a company and basically bringing something into the world that didn't exist beforehand, whether it's a product, a service, whatever it is, I think that there is something very godly about that, which means it could be very, very powerful and used for Kedusha, or it could be incredibly dangerous. And I think we all know entrepreneurs who let their ego get to their head in a massive way and basically crash and burn. So I think that is a big part about it as well. And then I think the last thing that I'll mention also ashkafically is there's this idea, if you want something, you daven, but you also need to make a kli for it. And you need to make a kli for that bracha. And if you're someone who, let's just say wealth is very important to you and you want to have and unlock a lot of wealth, I think you need to make that kli for a bracha a lot bigger. And you're going to be capped as it is, working for someone else, working in a company. And if you go start your own thing, that is widening up kind of your surface area to luck ratio, as we call it in the secular world, or in the frum world, it would be kind of your, the kli for shefa.
That's so interesting. And I actually never thought of the connection between a yoledes and an entrepreneur, the danger in entrepreneurship and the fact that, today, Baruch Hashem, with modern medicine, childbirth is a relatively safe endeavor, the labor itself, but it used to be, not so long ago, very, very dangerous, very, very life-threatening, which is why we still have the minhag or the mitzvah to bench Birkat HaGomel afterwards. That's a really cool insight. And it sort of comes back to something else which we've been sort of talking about a little bit. We've talked about creating content on whether it's LinkedIn or other platforms, saying that you are very involved in whether newsletters and other things. So even people who aren't entrepreneurs, the ability to create content, to share ideas, to create a new side product has never been easier. And I'm wondering specifically how you think about the balance between the opportunities that the current digital landscape allows, along with the dangers of getting sucked in, of putting out content that's not really worthwhile. How would you go about advising someone who wants to maybe be a little more creative, be a little more of a Telem Elokim in that regard, but also doesn't want to get sucked into things which are either just addictive, semi-addictive, or worlds of influencers that don't seem so Torah values based, but there obviously is great opportunity here. So how do you think about that world, which you're very much involved in and on a few different angles?
Yeah, again, wow, excellent question. And there are kind of going to be two parts to my question. There's going to be first addressing the content piece and sort of addressing how that fits in with Torah values. The number one advice I give to people who want to be creative, who want to start their own thing is there is an opportunity right now. Maybe it's an arbitrage opportunity. I'm not sure how to exactly define it, but creating good content on social media is one of the highest leverage things you can be doing for you professionally, especially when we talk about building a personal brand, building an audience. We don't need to go into business and everything, but none of the past 12 months would have been possible without kind of having built an audience and posted content before. So I think it is incredibly important. And right now I post every day on LinkedIn, and I'm actually starting to post every day on X and also hopefully Instagram. And that begs the question, how are you now supposed to daven 3 times a day in a minyan, learn Torah, and then post across 4 social media channels, check them, comment, whatever? It is impossible, and it's setting yourself up for failure. So part A of the question, it is incredibly important. I definitely think people should be doing it. Part B is, how do you balance that? That is an excellent question. And I think 2 things. Number 1 is I show up on social media as my full self, meaning I show up there as a Jew, I show up there as an Israeli, and I show up there as someone who struggles openly with different things and different ideas, meaning I don't just showcase one part of my identity. I had a post that went pretty viral of me wrapping my old CEO into tefillin, and a lot of people, including Yossi Farah, really like that. I have posts where I talk about running into bomb shelters in the middle of the night, and I'm very open about that. And I have posts like the one that I'm posting today, where I talk about how the past year has been incredible, but it's also been one of the toughest years of my life for a lot of reasons. So number 1 is not putting on a mask and showing up as authentically yourself. And I think you could actually be a massive Kiddush Hashem on social media as well. I don't think it's a steer at all. That would kind of be advice number 1. And advice point number 2 is the only way this is going to work is if you're incredibly disciplined. Incredibly disciplined about, 1, staying active on social media, about posting, and number 2, incredibly disciplined about staying off on social media. Meaning, if we look at my phone and if we look at my computer, whatever it is, I have all of these systems in place over time that I have. My LinkedIn feed is permanently blocked with a Chrome extension. I can't just scroll through LinkedIn. My Instagram, if I try to download Instagram on my phone, it is blocked. I remove it because just like posting content is incredibly valuable, these are billion-dollar companies with all the resources they have to make you incredibly addicted. And as a religious and Orthodox Jew, time is a thing that matters most. And you have to set up all of these systems, these diligent systems, to not be sucked in. So that was kind of like a long-winded answer, but it's a topic I feel very passionately about.
Right. And then the question then becomes, and I think about this all the time, are those 2 components, the importance of posting and the danger of spending too much time, and the industry that you're sort of contributing to, right? At the end of the day, you're playing the game, you're putting out content that is for other people, is part of their doom scrolling. Is that something that you ever feel tension around?
No, because I think, again, what do I stress in my content, and also what we do for customers, by the way? I didn't even talk about what I do, but the focus on both is authenticity. How do we take someone, whether it's myself, whether it's one of our customers, and give the whole picture? And that's what people want in today's day and age, whether it's marketing, sales. People just want someone else to be real. Also with Judaism, by the way, there's a big parallel there. Just like on LinkedIn, I want to follow a CEO who's real. The rabbis that I want to listen to, that's why everyone's coming towards Neo-Hasidus, which is kind of where I find myself. We just want the MS. That's what we want, and that's what people want. And I actually think there's no steer on there whatsoever, because social media, what's the difference between ideally someone posting something raw and authentic on LinkedIn versus sitting down for a very scripted interview or a TV ad? One is a lot more authentic and one is someone acting. And I think anyone that brings someone's core message out into this world in a less polished and more real way, whether it's a Rav giving a shiur or whether it's a CEO posting online, To me, I think that is getting people closer towards MS. So that's why I think there's no stira.
Fascinating. And then you sort of alluded to maybe the last topic that we'll sort of dive into for now. This obviously could be its own series of podcasts, but we talked about AI in this space. So to me, it's so obvious that based on the way you described the gold standard of MStic content, AI is so limited in its effect on the core, meaning there's so much you can do to make things faster and easier and editing. But at the end of the day, if the core is you have an authentic life, authentic experiences, authentic insights, and you're using these platforms to share them, AI, to my mind, doesn't really touch that core value. It's only around in the trapping. So do you agree with that framing?
Yeah, and it's basically chicken or egg. Like, why is that becoming the most important lever right now? It's because content has never been cheaper. I mean, even think about it. I'm thinking back into like the Judaism world. There were a few of like these quote unquote influencers who took off. Like, there are AI rabbis right now. I don't just need the answer to my halachic shaila. I can go to ChatGPT. I'm not advising this, but like I used to text my rabbi all my questions, and now like ChatGPT is getting better. Claude's getting better. I can have sources and source material. What ChatGPT or what Claude can't give me is a real chizuk, real personalized to me. And I think it's the same with content, and it's chicken or egg. Is that, and I think AI and the fact that content and answers and information is cheap. Think about this, like our parents or maybe our grandparents. I don't know how old the listeners are. My dad, for instance, if he wanted answers to something, he needed to go to the library and find a book, check out a book, read, find the exact section. What did I have to do and what did we have to do? We had to go to Google and we still had to search a little bit. What do the kids of this generation have to do? Basically nothing. Just type ChatGPT, skip Google, whatever it is. Information is cheap. Answers are cheap. The only thing that really breaks through is storytelling. And to me, it's more of a chicken or egg. So yes, that is definitely prominent. But the reason why it's so prominent is because all the advancements we have right now with AI.
Amazing. Okay, Alex, this has been such a fun conversation and really great. Always so much energy and interesting stories and insights when we're talking. So I appreciate that. So let's go to our lightning round. 3 short questions, 3 hopefully short answers. We're in the summer. We have nice long Shabbat afternoons. What do you like to do at that time?
Shabbat afternoons, I like to take a stroll with my wife and our 4-month-old.
Amazing. Do you have a favorite sefer on Parshat Shavua?
Favorite sefer on Parshat Shavua, I would say Evan Shlomo, Rabbi Shlomo Katz on Reb Shlomo Karlebach.
Amazing. And finally, if you were forced by gunpoint to quit your job, quit your company, find some new role in some new industry, maybe something you dreamed of doing as a kid, what would that be?
I think I would become a marine biologist.
Cool. All right. Alec Kremins, thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Yaakov. Really appreciate it.
All right. Take care.